Hello and welcome back to the Data Privacy Lawyer. My name is Funmi Owolabi and I am the principal attorney at the firm. Today's review is going to be on some AI terms. Now, I've specifically picked these terms because I think it's valuable to look at a couple provisions related to this artificial intelligence policy. So all of the documents I ever review come from internet. I just want to mention that because it may be that some of these have been updated while you're watching this. I'm going to zoom in because there's a couple things I want to talk about specifically with this policy. So we can see here that they've got the date that this was approved. And then they've also provided insight into what constitutes artificial intelligence with their organization. The other thing I want to make mention of is the title of this document. Now, I've talked a lot about the distinction between notice and policy in lots of different reviews. If you're interested in that, check those out on my channel. Now, to me, as a practitioner, this is a true policy because the tone is generally an internal document that discusses how things are done within this organization. The audience here are executives and employees. This is not something that is generally distributed online to a customer-facing audience. A notice, on the other hand, is for a public-facing audience addressing what is done in practice internally. This is an internal document. It is a true policy. A privacy notice or an artificial intelligence notice would be something that is distributed to a public-facing audience, not an internal audience, that addresses what the practices look like. So let's say, for example, this particular policy is 3 pages. If an organization is going to be drafting an artificial intelligence notice, that is something that they want their customers to see. Their customers would not be privy to internal insights about what's happening within the organization. And that is the true distinction of a policy and a notice. And I've talked about this in other reviews. I think it's really important for organizations, particularly let's talk about the privacy notice. The notice you're placing on a website is something that you're letting any person on the internet see. A policy is generally something that's distributed internally. Let me give you an example. A provision you might write on your privacy notice is, we retain personal data for as long as is required based on the use of service or your purpose for using our service. That is a provision that would traditionally appear on a notice. Now, the retention policy that is distributed internally to your IT team is going to have specific instances of when certain personal data is retained. For example, we retain a full name and email address for 6 years. Full stop. That is a sentence that generally will apply on a policy. You don't need to distribute that to your customers. What your customers need to know is that you're retaining data in relation to the service they're obtaining. That's a sentence for a notice. A sentence for a policy would be, these are the identifiers we collect. 1, full name. 2, email address. And then within that retention policy, you're then putting name is retained 5 days. Email address is retained 6 days. So in that respect, you can see that the notice and the policy align. And that's why I specifically chose this, because I think that this is a very good representation of what constitutes a policy, because the audience here are directors, employees, and executives, right? Now, I'm intrigued about why this has been offered online, but I still think it's very good for insight purposes for organizations to be able to understand what is necessary and what is required. Now, you might be wondering, why is a privacy lawyer looking at an AI policy? Well, shortly, we're going to address things like data processing. We've got data in there. We've got data compilation as well. So even if you're going to be talking about artificial intelligence, every component of the organization deals with processing of personal data in some capacity. How do we know this? This is going to deal with how employees use artificial intelligence, directors, and executives. And even in this first paragraph, we've got discussion about artificial intelligence technology playing an increasing important role in data processing. Now, if you're brand new to this channel, I've talked a lot about data processing. In data processing, the word processing means something very specific in the data protection world. Processing is any operation or set of operations on personal data. So in saying that, we know that there is a relationship between how artificial technologies are going to be used at this organization and the processing of personal data. Now, the other thing I want to mention before we get into some more of the provisions here is the fact that personal data is any information that identifies an individual. And with the sophistication of technologies, more and more data is fitting within that definition. We're not just looking at traditional identifiers like name and email address. We're looking at things like IP address, behavioral data, gamification information. There is so much data now that can be tied back to an individual and constitute personal data. I hope that wasn't too much of a legal definition, because I think the point of this channel is education. What do businesses need to know? Now let's keep looking at the definitions here. Now they've got a definition of what constitutes a supplier, which I think is valuable. ThaiBev respects and protects the privacy and the personal data of AI system users. I've talked a lot about this in lots of my terms of service reviews. When we're looking at AI terms, particularly with these artificial intelligence tools, systems, and technologies, generally, and I'm yet to encounter this, if you've encountered this, leave a comment below. Most of the AI systems that are available require authentication of at least one user. And that authentication can manifest itself in many different ways, but it could be a username and password. It could be an email address and password. The fact that those two identifiers can indicate that someone is a person constitute personal data, and there are responsibilities that an organization has. AI systems for this organization must be designed and developed in accordance with personal data protection laws. Now you might say, why are they using laws in general? I don't know much about this organization. I'm just going to discuss what I know from a privacy perspective. It's really important for companies to know which personal data protection laws apply to them. And you have to be able to review the thresholds in all of the geographies where you process personal data. Let me give you an example. Maybe you have employees in Canada, and then you also have suppliers in Brazil, and then you also have a subsidiary in China. In each of these instances, I've just identified groups of individuals, and those groups of individuals, they have rights associated with them as a person. My name is Funmi, and I live in the US. There are rights that I have related to my personal data. And when a company obtains my information, they need to make sure that if they meet certain thresholds in the United States, they are going to protect my information, because there are laws that require the organization to adhere to certain compliance obligations based on their processing of my personal data. And that is what is really being addressed here, irrespective of the type of system. Now, this specific system is an artificial intelligence system. Prior to the advent of artificial intelligence, we had ordinary systems that still processed personal data. The responsibilities and the development and design of those systems must be in accordance with the privacy laws. Now, if you as a business are just processing personal data without looking at the thresholds, you're not absolved of potential repercussions from different regulatory bodies related to your privacy practices. And that's why I do a lot of reviews on this channel, to see what are organizations doing out there related to personal data, because it influences how your business can operate. If you put your business in a position where you've not addressed what your privacy obligations are, you could find yourself at the end of a line with an enforcement action, which jeopardizes the way in which your business can operate and leads to a lot of delays within the organization, because you're then having to answer to letters from a regulator. So I really hope you enjoyed this particular review. If you have comments about what I've stated, leave a comment below, and I'll see you in another one.